So I get asked a lot of questions about emotional intelligence, and probably one of the most common questions I get asked is, how do I develop self-awareness? So as we talk about self-awareness, we know that self-awareness is more than just this idea of understanding emotion. It's broken down into three areas: an emotional self-assessment, an accurate self-assessment, and self-confidence. Today we're going to talk about accurate self-assessment, what it is, and how we go about conducting that so that we can improve every aspect of our life and the relationships that are most important to us. So this is part 2 of our 3-part series on emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Click here to view part 1. So now I'm going to introduce you to the aspects of accurate self-assessment. So as we now begin to expand self-awareness and we talk about accurate self-assessment, we're going to go through a bunch of questions for you to consider to be able to identify for yourself how accurate you can get at becoming more self-aware. I accurately identify my talents and strengths. You know, it's interesting, as I was years ago developing my personal mission statement and my contribution document, the very first activity the guy had me do, my coach had me do, was he gave me this piece of paper and he said, you need to answer these questions. And on there, the first question was, what are your strengths? And I thought, wow, this is really hard. And so I sat down and I wrote down, and I think I came up with about 4 or 5 strengths that week for my assignment. And then the next week when we came together, I emailed it to him and he got on and he said, so you only have 4 strengths or 5 strengths? I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, I probably have more. And I found that was probably the hardest part of my whole journey of developing my personal constitution, was to sit down and really personally identify what were my strengths. He said I couldn't stop until I got to 25. So it's interesting that I sat and I went through it, but then I started to kind of talk to other people. So what do you think some of my strengths were, to get an idea of what other people thought? So I ended up getting my 25 strengths. And as I looked at that, I started to realize that, you know what? I'm not that bad of a person, right? Or I'm actually pretty good. I've got a lot of these great strengths. So this idea in developing this accurate self-assessment begins with your ability to really believe in who you are and the strengths that you have. Now, to follow up with that, the next activity was, well, so now identify what your weaknesses are. Now, the interesting part of that one was I had no problem coming up with 25 of those. But I think that's natural. I think a lot of us become much more hard on ourselves, and we can come up with the weaknesses more than we could the strengths. But it's still important to understand that I have these strengths, but I also have these weaknesses, because it's those weaknesses that I want to be able to begin to accurately assess. And how do I begin to weaken them? Not so they become necessary strengths, but that they don't become detrimental to me in my behaviors as I interact with other humans. So it's just as important to identify my weaknesses as it was my strengths, so that I can begin to really understand where I'm coming from as a human, so that I can grow and progress in this idea of emotional intelligence through this accurate self-assessment. So the third area that we're going to look at is I introspectively evaluate and learn from past experiences. Now, all of us have past experiences. We've had them, we review them, we go over them. But the question is do we really learn? Have you ever, as are engaging in a current experience, have you ever sat there and said, man, I did this last time, and I keep doing that. It doesn't seem like I can ever change that aspect of it. I think a lot of us have that as part of our problem in change, is that we don't necessarily learn from our past experiences. So being self-aware and increasing my emotional self-assessment and be more accurate is to be able to understand what are those areas that I've learned from, and what are areas that I could learn from, so that I can improve my behavior as I move forward. So the fourth element of this is that I invite and internalize feedback from others. Now this is kind of hard, right? As I begin to gather information and gather data, it's pretty scary to open yourself up and ask other people, so what do you think? As I did, what are my strengths, but also what are some of the weaknesses that I have? Am I really open? Will I really listen to what they have to say? So that's part of this accurate self-assessment, is being open, not just listening and asking for feedback, being open for that feedback so that you can begin to change. Another areas that we can talk about are, and I'll lump these two together, we can invite and accept new ideas, and you strive to learn and improve. Years ago, a guy said that he was a leader in an organization, and I asked him, I said, so what kind of books are you reading? What kind of blogs are you participating in? What kind of things are you learning to continue to grow? And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, when did you go to school? He says, about 25 years ago. So what you're telling me is you're leading today a group of people based off of information that you gained 25 years ago about what great leaders were. He's like, well, yeah. I said, do you think that's a problem? Do you think that people today are a little bit different than people were 25 years ago? So if you aren't continually growing and improving, gaining more knowledge, gaining more understanding, you'll soon be left behind. That's just what happens. And so part of this accurate self-assessment is really determining where are you, where should you be, and what are you doing to increase your ability to learn and grow, and are you open for that? So the last thing we'll talk about is your ability to recognize how your strengths and weaknesses can affect personal performance. So ultimately, in the end, this idea of emotional intelligence is tied to your behavior, which is tied to the results that you're currently getting in your personal or professional life. And so as you're doing this accurate self-assessment, you want to be able to get clear about, one, do you understand that you've got strengths? Do you understand that you have weaknesses? And do you know what they are? Writing them down is critical to this process. Everything that we've talked about is to sit down and write down, create a document that answers these questions. And then as you look at that and fine-tune that document, then be able to say, now, how is this impacting my behavior and the results that I'm getting? If you can do that, that ultimately that now becomes your beginning point. You know the results you're currently getting, you know what's influencing that, what's driving some of that behavior, and where you need to go to change and improve. And as you begin to work on this a little at a time, your relationships will begin to grow and enhance in both your personal and professional life, and you'll find yourself gaining what I think all of us want, is just to be more happy. Be sure to subscribe and watch the other videos in this series. And you can join us on our mission to putting the human back into humanity.